Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Inshallah, in today's lecture, we are going to take two topics, two chunks. The first, we're going to talk about the absolute and the restricted, the mutlaq and the muqayyad. The mutlaq and the muqayyad is very similar to the aam and the khas. So it will sound the same. They're a little bit different. We'll show the differences, but they'll sound the same. But basically, our concern here is to see the statements that we read in the Quran and the Sunnah. Is the statement an absolute statement, mutlaq, it applies in all circumstances, or is there a taqeed to it? Is there something that restricts its meaning? And then therefore, when you have both the mutlaq and the muqayyad together, whether they be in the same sentence or sequence, or they be elsewhere, like, a verse here and then many chapters later a verse there, how do you put them together? And does one restrict the other, or does one abrogate the other? So those are some of the issues that we're going to look at in that. And then how, if it's not an issue in abrogation, how do they work together? How does the muqayyad, how does the restricted restrict that which is general? And then the second topic that we're going to talk about is the apparent and interpretive meanings. Apparent and interpretive meanings, al-zahir wal-mu'awwal. So apparent meaning is obviously, the statement means what it means, the word means what it means. And then the interpretive meaning is that we are going to take the word away from its direct meaning for some type of reason. So we're going to look at one of those reasons. Sometimes there's an easy, close reason, and sometimes there's a reason that's a little bit of a stretch reason. Both are doable, but we need to look at how. Now, I should mention in this section, in the text, it's very compressed, and he gives like 3 or 4 examples from the Quran and the Sunnah, but he only mentions a part of the verse or a part of the hadith. And I'm actually, in my translation, I'm going to actually give you the whole hadith, because otherwise I don't think it makes any sense unless you have all of these hadith and Quran memorized. And these examples are from the Hanafi, are going to be from the Hanafi approach to the type of interpretation. Okay, these are the main topics. We'll begin the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so we begin the way we normally begin, which is to turn to our text and say, قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. So our author, Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, and we benefit from his knowledge in this world and the next. المطلق والمقيد. المختار أن المطلق ما دل على الماهية بلا قيد. The chosen opinion is that an absolute statement is that which indicates the essence of something without conditions. And that's very important. It's the essence that we are looking at, not the manifestation of that essence. In other words, one of the examples that he gives is he talks about the word or the verb daraba, to strike, to hit. What is the essence of that? The essence is that if I took this hand and I went like that, that's the essence. Also, if I punched, also if I tapped, if I took like my pen and I went like this, all of those would fulfill. But when it comes to the absolute statement, the mutlaq, what is sought after is its essence. So when we come to the verse, وَالَّتِي تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنَّ فَعِظُوهُنَّ وَاهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ وَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ, women that you are fearful of their disobedience, advise them, admonish them, do not engage with them sexually, strike them. وَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ. What is sought after in that statement is that it is its essence, meaning the least amount of action that would fulfill the word is what is intended. Otherwise, there would need to be a description for that. So when we define the absolute statement as that which indicates the essence of something without conditions, then in that verse, you can see how consequential this definition is, because if you didn't understand that, then you would say a man can hit his wife, can hurt his wife, which is absolutely haram. So this is an important concept. It's not something that's abstract. And then he says, وَالْمُطْلَقُ وَالْمُقَيَّدُ كَالْعَامِ وَالْخَاصِ. The absolute and the restricted are like the general and specific. That one can act on the other. The Quran can restrict the Quran, the Sunnah can restrict the Sunnah, so on and so forth, just like we talked about in the Aam and the Khas. وأنهما في الأصح إن اتحد حكمهما وسببه وكان مثبتين فإن تأخر المقيد عن العمل بالمطلق نسخه. The correct opinion is that if both of them are united in their rulings and cause, and they are both affirmative, and the restricting clause is delayed after the action of the general one, then the restricting clause has abrogated the general statement. So, you have a general statement and then you have a restricted statement. They're both affirming something, affirming an action. But the restricting one is delayed after or comes after the action that was intended or instructed by the general statement. In that example, the restricting clause has abrogated the general clause because it has come after the action. If it comes before the action is done, then the restricting clause restricts the action. So, an example of non-abrogation, when Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, in one expiation فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ, to free a slave, and then in another instance فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ, to free a believing believing slave. The first example, to free a slave, now that's a general statement. Then the second one, to free a believing slave, it is restricted. We have described that that slave has to be a believing slave. So in this example, because no one has done the sin yet that would require the expiation, we take this restricted one and it applies to the general statement. So this is not an example of naskh, this is not an example of abrogation, but rather this is an example of the restricting statement restricting the general statement. But, and we said this I think maybe in a previous lecture or two, when the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kuntu anhaakum an ziyarat al-quburi ala fazaruha," I used to forbid you from visiting the graves, now visit the graves. Now this is a clear indication of abrogation. Actually, this is the most, the cleanest, most straightforward statement of abrogation, because the Prophet ﷺ himself said, "I used to say something and now I'm telling you to do something else." So that's sort of, I use that example for you to think about abrogation, because it would make sense. Abrogation is that a hukum has been established. Abrogation will come, I think, in a couple of we'll get to abrogation before the end of this unit, inshallah. Abrogation is that a hukum is established and then something comes to change that hukum, to alter that hukum, either to make it more difficult or to make it easier or to remove it completely, etc. Okay, now when it comes to the general, when it comes to the absolute and the restricted statements, what will indicate that there is abrogation is that the restricting statement comes after the first statement or the general statement or the hukm has been established. Okay, so let me just read that sentence again, or those two sentences, so we're on the same page. The correct opinion is that if both statements are united in their rulings and causes, and they are both affirmative, affirming an act, and the restricted clause is delayed from the action of the general one, meaning it comes after the action of the general one, then the restricting clause has abrogated the general statement. If not, meaning it hasn't come later, then the restricting clause has restricted the general one. Like the example of free a slave, free a believing slave. Okay. وإن كان أحدهما مثبتا والآخر خلافه قيد المطلق بضد الصفة وإلا قيد بها في الأصح. If one statement is affirming and the other is restricting, so now we have one statement that affirms an act and another statement that restricts the act. The general is restricted with the opposite meaning. So, if somebody said, أعتق رقبة, free a slave, and then that's a general statement, and then the next statement that's restricting says, لا تعتق رقبة كافرة, do not free a disbelieving slave. What's the opposite of that? The opposite is to, if I tell you don't free a disbelieving slave, then I'm also saying free a believing slave. So that's why he says, if one statement is affirming and the other is restricting, the general is restricted by the opposite meaning. The opposite meaning of the restricted, like our example. So, instead of saying if one statement is affirming, let's say if an absolute statement, to be consistent with our nomenclature. So if an absolute statement is affirming, either it's a command or it's a khabar or it's a statement, and then the other one is restricting, the general is restricted by the opposite meaning. And let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَإِلَّا قُيِّدَ وإلا قيد بهما عفوا وإلا قيد بها في الأصح. Otherwise, if they are both negating statements, they are restricted by each other, in which case this becomes an issue of specific and general. So, if somebody said, لا يجزئ عتق مكاتب, it is not sufficient that you free the mukatab slave, the slave that is, has contracted, is on a process to free themselves. We'll talk about that in fiqh when we get to the last section of fiqh. So, لا يجزئ عتق مكاتب, it's not sufficient that you free the mukatab type of slave. And that, so that's a negative statement. And then the second statement is لا يجزئ عتق مكاتب كافر. It is not sufficient that you free a non-believing mukatab slave. So here we have two statements that are in the negative. So that's why he said, if both are negating statements, this one negates something generally and this one negates something specifically, they are restricted by each other, in which case this is an issue of general and specific. So there's a general statement of not freeing a mukatab slave and then not freeing the mukatab slave that is a disbeliever. So in both cases, the deduction is you cannot free a mukatab slave because the first one is a general statement. So the second one, it's almost like it's not consequential, because whether the mukatab slave is a believer or not a believer, you said it's not sufficient to free a mukatab slave. So this is an example of the general and the specific. And then he says, وَإِنْ اخْتَلَفَ حُكْمُهُمَا أَوْ سَبَبَهُمَا وَلَمْ يَكُنْ ثَمَّ مُقَيِّدٌ بِمُتَنَافِيَيْنِ أو كان أولى بأحدهما قيد قياسا في الأصح. Let me read the translation because it's a little lengthy to make the sense, and then we'll come back and explain it. If the ruling is different but has the same cause, or the cause is different but the ruling is the same, and there is no restrictor to negate, then the general is restricted by the specific by way of analogy. So the first example, if the ruling is different, but they have the same cause. So Allah says in Surah An-Nisa verses 43, فَامْسِحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ وَأَيْدِيكُمْ, in the verse of tayammum. And then in the verse in Ma'idah verse 6, the verse of wudu, Allah Ta'ala says, فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ, to wash your faces and hands up until the elbow. So here, the ruling is different, but the cause is the same, which is what happens when you don't have wudu, when you're in a state of hadath and you need to wash for prayer. But the ruling is different because in one instance you don't have water, because it's saying famsahu, to wipe, meaning wipe with the earth. And then in the second verse, Allah Ta'ala is saying faghsilu, so wash, meaning with water. So the ruling is different, but the cause is the same. That's the first example. The second example, this is all about how you put the mutlaq and the muqayyad together, by the way. The second example, they have the same cause. Afwan. The cause is different, but the ruling is the same. Like فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ, Mujadala verse 3, and in Nisa verse 92, فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ. The ruling here is the same, which is the freeing of the slave, but the cause of causing the freeing of the slave is different. In the first one, فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ, this is the expiation for dhihar. When a man tells his wife, you are to me like the back of my mother. It has to be that exact phraseology. And then in the second instance, the expiation is for involuntary manslaughter. So the cause is different. The cause of both of those rulings is different, but the ruling is the same. But the ruling is the same, one is general and one is restricted. So we still put them together. So in other words, we're trying to find out, when do we put the general and the restricted together? The first example is that the ruling is different, but the cause is the same. The ruling is different, water, no water, for wudu, but the cause is the same, I'm in a state of hadath. The second example is that the cause is different. There are two sins that lead to this expiation, but the ruling is the same. And in the ruling being the same, one is general and one is specific, so we put them together. And then the third example, there is those are the two examples. There's two examples. My bad. Or if one of the general statements should be restricted. I missed a part of the translation. Let me read the sentence again. If the ruling is different but have the same cause, example 1. Or the cause is different but have the same ruling, number 2. Or if one of the general statements should be restricted, 3. The general is restricted by way of analogy in the dominant opinion. So the third example is if one of the general statements should be restricted, like the sequence of verses. One of them is the kafara of the oath, فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ, fast 3 days. And then comes the kafara of dhihar, the act of dhihar, فَصِيَامُ شَهْرَيْنِ مُتَتَابِعَيْنِ. If you can't find the slave, then you have to fast 60 or 2 consecutive months. And then if you engage in tamattu, in luxury items in the Hajj, the expiation is فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ فِي الْحَجِّ وَسَبْعَةٍ إِذَا رَجَعْتُمْ تِلْكَ عَشْرَةٌ كَامِلَةٌ. You fast 3 days in the Hajj, and then 7 when you go home. Those are 10. So here we have 3 verses that have 3 different causes, and they're actually different rulings about fasting. But there is the statements should be restricted in the sense that those days are meant to be fast consecutively. Because in one of them, which is the kafara of dhihar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَصِيَامُ شَهْرَيْنِ مُتَتَابِعَيْنِ, fast the days consecutively. So that restrictor should restrict the other mentions of expiations of fast, that the fast be consecutive. And as a default rule, any act of worship is meant to be consecutive. Okay, so let me go back and read that statement from the beginning so we have a full thought. If the ruling, here the issue is, how do you put the general, how do you put the absolute and the restricted together? You're going to do this through qiyas, through analogy, if the ruling is different but they have the same cause, or if the cause is different but the ruling is the same and there's no restrictor, there's no restrictor that negates the act. And number 3, if one of the general statements should be restricted, then the general is restricted by the specific by way of analogy in the dominant opinion. And we'll pick up the next discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, for our final section here, al-zahir wal-mu'awwal, apparent and interpretive meanings. Al-zahiru ma dalla dalalatan dhanniyya. An apparent meaning is what provides a probable meaning. Probable based on established precedent, definitions, custom, etc. والتأويل حمل الظاهر على المحتمل المرجوح. To interpret the meaning away from the apparent one means to apply the most likely meaning. So we said the apparent meaning is the most probable meaning. If I'm going to interpret it, do ta'wil, the most probable meaning there are other meanings of that word. But most probably, the most probable, this is the definition of the word. If I say asad, lion, you think it's the most likely meaning is the animal. You can use asad for a brave person. So that's to do ta'wil. That's to do to make an interpretation of that. It has to be based on one of the likely meanings. Otherwise, it's just abath. It's just nothing. والتأويل حمل الظاهر على المحتمل المرجوح فإن حمل للدليل فصحيح. If your interpretation is done based on proof, it is sound. So we see somebody coming from battle, or we're reading a story about we're reading about the great battle of Al-Qadisiyah, or the great battle of Badr or Uhud or something like that, and you say and then the Asad took the battlefield or something like that. Okay, I mean in the context there's a reason, there's a dalil why you're saying that, because you're talking about warfare, you're talking about this brave battle, and you're talking about the great heroic efforts of the warriors. So there's a dalil, there's a reason why you do that. أو لما يظن دليلا ففاسد. If your interpretation is done on proof, based on proof, it's sound. If it is done on an assumed proof, it is false. Okay, so and then he says, أو لا لشيء فلعب. And when it is done for no reason, it is a play with meanings. Okay, so if you do interpretation based on a proof, the interpretation is sound. If you do it on an assumed proof, then the interpretation is false. And if you do it for no reason, you have no proof, no dalil why you did that, then you're just playing with the meanings of the word. That's like the postmodern world. Gender doesn't really mean what it means. Gender and biology are separate. That's just a bunch of nonsense. There's no proof for that. Because it goes against the physical established biological genders and the chromosomes that go into making. There's only those two sets. So that's the proof. So when you just no, it's not really like. Then he says it's lab. You're just playing with the meanings. That actually is of no meaning. It's so useless. It's not even. There's no point even engaging in it. But there's the middle part where there will be debate, where somebody thinks there's a proof, thinks there's a dalil, thinks there's a reason why there needs to be a reinterpretation of something. Now their reinterpretation is false, but it's false because they had a false assumption on the dalil. So it's really about like the investigator with the illah. You got to be the investigator and investigate the dalil to be able to prove it. Okay, and then he says, rahimahullah, كَتَأْوِيلِ. Now this is where the text, he just mentions like one word of a hadith or one word of a verse, and it doesn't, it doesn't make any sense. Oh, sorry. وَالْأَوَّلُ قَرِيبٌ وَبَعِيدٌ. There are two types of interpretations. One is near and one is far. Let me give you he doesn't do this in the text, but let me give it to you. The near example. So a correct type of interpretation can either be near or far. What is an example of a near interpretation? Like when we read in the Quran, إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ. We took that verse in the previous clip. It literally says when you stand to pray, wash. The near interpretation is when you desire to pray. So you don't interpret the word قُمْتُمْ as literally when you're standing to pray, then stop the prayer and go make wudu and then come back to the line. Meaning, Allah is telling us, this is a ta'wil, means when you desire to pray, if you desire to stand to pray, then wash before you pray. Another example is when Allah Ta'ala says, وَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنِ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ. When you read the Quran, if you desire to read the Quran, when you are about to read the Quran, then say, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So this is a type of ta'wil, this is a type of interpretation because you're taking the meaning away from the dominant literal meaning, but for a reason, because there's no way that the meaning would stand. Now, what's an example of a far type of example? He's going to give us a few examples that the Hanafis have. The first one, he says, Tawil emsik. Let me just read you my translation because it's not going to make sense if we read the Arabic. An example of far interpretation, let me just add that. Example of far interpretation is the Hanafi interpretation of the hadith of Ghailan, rahimahullah, radiallahu anhu, who became Muslim when he had 10 wives. The Prophet ﷺ told him, hold. Amsik. Now, he had 10 wives. The Prophet ﷺ said, hold 4 and divorce the rest. Hold, the Hanafis interpreted as to begin anew. Ibda. Bi-ibda. Like to remarry almost. Or does it mean hold the first 4 that you married chronologically? So there are different, interpretations. But the Hanafis are going to say it means to begin anew with the marriage. There's also the interpretation of the verse. This is 58:4, which is Surah Al-Mujadala. فإطعام 60 مسكينة. اللهم صل. I lost my place. اللهم صل على سيدنا Muhammad. Likewise, interpreting the verse, feed 60 from the poor. You interpret this to mean 60 mud, meaning that you can give the 60 mud of food to one person. Or you can give a mud to 60 people. One mud to 60 people, which would be 60 mud. So, to interpret it'am, to feed, to interpret that as to feed the amount, the 60 mud, to one person. Likewise, interpreting the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Let me just see where this is narrated. Okay, it's eluding me at the moment. Abu Dawood. There is no fast for the person who does not have a prior intention, meaning to have the intention the night before. To interpret this to only include make-up fasts and fasts that you have sworn to make, al-nudhur. Because there are other dalil or other hadith that talk about the person who chooses to fast or the sultan of themselves, they can choose to fast or break their fast. We interpret that hadith as Shafi'is to be restricted to that. The Hanafis, if I'm not mistaken, it's more general. And then lastly, likewise, to interpret the hadith, the slaughter of the child is through the slaughter of the mother, to mean similar. Dhakatul janeen, dhakat ummihi. This is also in Abu Dawood. Meaning that if you slaughter an animal that's pregnant, the slaughter of the mother would also suffice for the slaughter of the child. Sorry, when it comes to the fast, this is the Hanafi interpretation. My bad, let me just backtrack 1 second. Their interpretation of the La siyam liman lam yubayyit, there's no fasting for the person who does not have a prior intention. To say that does not include make-up fasts and sworn fasts. So these are all examples that the Hanafi have of a correct interpretation that is considered far, not near. And with that, we conclude this section, and then the next section will be the mujmal we'll take in the next lecture. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's class, we were able to take two important chunks of our conversation of Usul Al Fiqh. The first one was the absolute and the restricted. The absolute and the restricted is similar to the general and the specific. And we talked about if there's an absolute statement and the restrictor is delayed beyond after the act, and that restrictor is an example of abrogation. If, however, which is more likely the case, that there's an absolute statement and then a restricted statement nearby or before the act is done, let's say, then the restricted statement restricts an aspect of the general, of the absolute statement. And then we spent quite a bit of time talking about how they fit together. So we went through the three examples. If the ruling is different but the same cause, or the cause is different and the ruling is the same, or one of the general statements needs to be restricted. We said in those three examples, the restriction takes place through qiyas, through some type of analogy, which is why qiyas is a fundamental part of our usul equipment. And then the second big chunk is we talked about the apparent and interpretive meanings. The apparent meaning is the most probable meaning of a word, and then the interpretation is to take another likely meaning. To be able to interpret, you have to have a dalil. There has to be a proof, a reason why you're doing it. If you have a proof, then the interpretation is sound. If you have a proof that ends up being wrong, you thought it was right, then it's a false, type of interpretation. And if you just sort of are playing with the words and there's no proof whatsoever, then you're just playing with words that doesn't mean anything. Of the correct type of interpretation, there are two types. There is near and far. The near, he doesn't give it in the text, but I gave them to you, is like, إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ, literally, when you stand to pray, then wash. Which means when you want to stand to pray, yani before you pray, you need to make wudu. So that's a type of interpretation. You're not taking the apparent meaning, but it makes sense because there's a clear dalil. That's kind of simple stuff. The more difficult conversation is when you have a far type of ta'wil, and he gave several, I think maybe 4 examples from the Quran and the Sunnah of how the Hanafis do a far type of interpretation, based of course on their dalil and their understanding of the proof text. Those are the major topics that we talked about. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.